Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 281. Thank you for joining us. Today, Maggie Hayden and Erica Treat return to the Kolbecast to help Bonnie and I welcome Erica's son, Eben, to the Kolbecast for a discussion on poetry. As a Kolbe alumnus and UD grad, Eben has been working with the Kolbe curriculum team on poetry throughout the literature program. We discuss the importance of poetry in classical education, the benefits it can provide in life, and why the beauty of good poetry is worthwhile in itself. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
Hi, Stephen, how are you?
Doing well. It's good. Whenever we're doing podcasts, I'm doing well. So if you keep listening in at the beginning of every podcast, it's like, it's great. I'm doing well. So it's always so much fun to kind of bring interesting people on and have a good conversation with them. So how about yourself, Bonnie? How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thank you. We're getting to talk with 2 of our favorite people here today on the Kolbecast and meet a new one as we were introducing a family member as well. So I'm very excited for the conversation. Back with us today are 2 very good friends of the Kolbecast, Erica Treat, who currently serves as curriculum project manager for Kolbe Academy. Hi, Erica.
Hi, thank you for having me again, Bonnie.
Of course. And it's been a bit since I've gotten to talk to you. So any opportunity is a welcome. And Maggie Hayden, who is Kolbe Academy's curriculum director, as well as Stephen's wife. Maggie, welcome back.
Hi, thank you for having me back. I enjoy being on this a lot. I've been on several recently, and I enjoy them all the time. It's a lot of fun to talk to people.
Good deal. Well, we always enjoy having you. So I'm glad that's working out as such. And now I'm happy to introduce Erica's son, Eben, who is both a Kolbe Academy alumnus and a contributor to the Kolbe curriculum team. Hi, Eben. Welcome to the Kolbecast.
Hello, it's good to be here.
We're really glad to meet you. It's my custom to ask every person making his or her debut on the Kolbecast, as you are, Eben, to tell us a bit about yourself and your Kolbe connection and your background. And specific to this conversation, maybe a glimpse of what poetry means to you, and then we'll get more from you as the conversation unfolds.
Okay. So I'm a Kolbe alumnus, as you already said. I have very fond memories of my education with Kolbe, especially the literature classes, which is somewhat relevant here, but also the philosophy. And I actually loved kind of the curriculum so much that I ended up going to the University of Dallas, which has their core is basically Kolbe, but if you wanted it at college level. So that was excellent. So I've read through all of the different kind of grades with philosophy and poetry twice now in an education setting. And when it comes to the Iliad specifically, which I'm definitely going to bring up a bit later, I've read the Iliad, I think 25 times now.
Yeah.
I really, really love Homer. So I have a quote from Chesterton to share about Homer, and then I'm a Catholic, basically lifelong. My family converted when I was very young, but that kind of informs my entire worldview. And it also informs my view of poetry and how poetry relates to other fields, because you often have this kind of debate. At least I did a lot in UD, but I've also seen it elsewhere, where how does poetry relate to philosophy? How does beauty relate to truth? And how these transcendentals kind of point towards God. And so that's a big part of it that's relevant for this. I also am a poet myself. I wasn't an English major or anything at the University of Dallas. I was a computer science major, and I took a lot of math electives, but that actually ties in with poetry, so we can get into that if you'd like a bit later,
Yeah.
how STEM and poetry relate. But I've written around 50 something sonnets and a handful of villanelles, and then several dozen poems that are kind of my own meter and rhyme schemes that I've just put together. And a lot of my sonnets have a weird, like I called a Frostian sonnet because I stole what Frost did for Acquainted with the Night, which is one of my favorite sonnets of all time. And then I just started writing sonnets that way. So I think that's all that's like super relevant, kind of as a background that's general. And then there's some things we can get into later.
So Erica, Maggie, and Eben are here to visit with us about poetry and a special place in Kolbe's curriculum. So let's dig in a little bit, and maybe we can continue where Eben kind of left off. Your enthusiasm for poetry is evident from the get-go. Where does that come from?
I would say so. My both of my parents had a hand in this. And that hand, I will say, is both direct and indirect. It's direct in that some of my fondest memories as a child are my father reading Tolkien to us, who is genuinely a poet and very underrated as a poet. Um, if you read like Fat Cat on Mat, he has a lot of wonderful children's poetry and some weird, strange poetry as well. And that kind of tinges into the Middle Earth kind of mythos. So my father had a hand in that and that kind of narrative element of poetry that so influenced. I also very distinctly remember for some reason when I was around 11, walking up to my father and he had a book in his hand and I was like, "What are you reading?" And he was like, "I'm reading Dante. I read it once a year or something." That's how I remember it. He might not actually have said that, but that's how 11-year-old Eben remembers it. I was like, "Dante, who's Dante?" Not knowing that I'd later learn Italian and read Dante in the original Italian. But so my father kind of had an influence on kind of the epic and the narrative of poetry. And then my mother who's herself, but I'm sure she'll speak of this, very fond of lyric poetry, would have my brother and I memorize lyric poetry. So things like "Oh Captain, My Captain" and "Ooey Gooey was a worm, a mighty worm was he," you know, wonderful children's classics. And some more serious poetry as well, which I've also kind of just kept doing. So I have some Frost and Poe and Keats memorized because those are poets who I just go to because I just resonate with how they weave words together. Um, so that's kind of, I think, where it originates from. And I've always written poetry as well because I just love to play with words and delight in the way that they can connect together to form complicated ideas, and you can reveal things you didn't even intend if you write a good poem.
Erica, where did your love for poetry come from?
Well, I remember in grade school doing, the write a haiku, that kind of,
Hmm.
that kind of stuff, right? I always enjoyed that. That was fun for me. But then as I got older, I started doing what now people refer to as a commonplace book, or maybe they did back then, but I had never heard the term back then. But I had a commonplace book and a diary all throughout my childhood. And this was not something someone told me to do, but it was something that I did on my own, where I would write down quotes from books that I had read or write down poems that I saw in the world. Um, I also weirdly collected floor plan ideas for houses in
Oh,
that
me too. I did
commonplace
that.
book. I have no idea why. So that's not poetic at all, but that was something that I would like make little floor plans for houses in my book. Um, so I collected floor plans as well in my in my book
Love it.
alongside poetry and stuff. So that was like for me, that was where it started for me. And then as I got older, I became introduced to more poetry, but my education wasn't classical and it didn't include that in any way beyond what other people may have received in non, like more traditional public schools or private schools. That was that. And then in college, my husband was in a great books program out of Biola University, which has a fun connection actually to UD. They did this, I think it was like a Dante reading or something like
Yeah,
that
it's
at the
like a
same
year
time.
of Dante,
Yeah,
and there's 7 schools that participate in it, and UD.
yeah. So it was kind of funny that Eben ended up at a school that had a tie to our to the university where my husband and I went to college. But so I was sort of got a secondhand introduction to a lot of classical stuff, but on my own, I was reading this stuff. I wasn't in that program, but I was reading a lot of this stuff on my own and exploring poetry and creative writing and things like that on my own. And then when I started homeschooling, it was really important for me to integrate poetry into the boys' curriculum and into what they were studying. Every year, I was very intentional about laying out a poetry plan, choosing poetry for the year. And there aren't actually a lot of resources like this out there. So I was building all of that stuff myself and building out the plan for their poetry every year. And I often would integrate it with studying great art at the same time. and sometimes doing art projects, but I am not an artsy, craftsy kind of person at all. And my kids are not really either. So that just didn't, that really wasn't our vibe, I guess. But we did do a lot of memory work with poetry. I think that's important for a lot of developmental reasons, memory work of all kinds, but poetry too, in terms of just it influences a lot of other ways that you interact with words and even with numbers. I feel like it can, Evan can probably speak to that better than me.
Very much.
But but so that was important to me, and I wanted to integrate that there, and we tried to make it fun. We bounced on trampolines, we used bouncy exercise balls as we were doing memory work. I remember Eben, we lived in this house at one point. We were a military family, so we've moved a lot, but we're back in a house that we had lived in a long time ago. And I remember him bouncing on an exercise ball back and forth through the school area where we would do school, practicing poems. We used it for other memory work too, but that works really well with the littles. So we did that, and then it grows as they get older in terms of what kinds of things that they're interacting with, and the ways that they're interacting with it changes.
We had some of those bouncy balls. Those are the best. What about you, Maggie? Tell me about you and poetry.
Well, I've always also loved poetry from the time I was young. I think it was something that was a regular part of our education growing up. We always had to learn poems every year. And we had some very good friends who are actually also connected to Kolbe, and that it was the Dr. Ferrier who wrote our Declaration of Statesmanship book that we use, that would have us come over to his house once a month to do poetry recitations. And we would all get up there, and do our little lyric poems, the swing, whatever it was that we were doing, Oh, Captain, my Captain. But he would get up there and do some very dramatic reading of some poem, and it was so impressive. But also impressive just to see someone who loved poetry so much. So it really was just the exposure to the poems regularly, having to memorize the poems every year. Just that was part of the curriculum. Every year there was like 4 or 5 poems we had to get through, and then seeing people who loved it around, surrounding, our family, and just this like a community event where people came together because of the poetry. It was really significant. And then my love was further developed when I was in college and got to hear somebody chant the Iliad in Greek, um, around a fire pit. And it was like one of the most beautiful things just to hear Gilead being chanted. And for the first time, I really saw it. Not, I knew it was a poem and an epic, but you could hear it was poetry. It was just so obvious. So that's really my background. But I also, having worked with children, I know that I had enough experience with children's, seeing children in like first grade, second grade through fifth, seeing the same children in high school, and seeing that the children who had done poetry when they were young liked to read when they were older and could read harder things. It was just such a striking thing, and I realized that those patterns of language that you're exposed to in literature are absolutely essential for reading complex books later and appreciating them. And so I wanted that for my own children. I wanted that myself. I wanted that for my children. And I actually want that for every Kolbe child. I want them to get to the Iliad and think, this is beautiful, not, huh? What's this about? I have a cool, I don't know, why am I reading about battles? I want them to actually be set up for that. And that was really the impetus behind a lot of our focus on this, was wanting to bring this love of poetry to children, to have them have that same benefit, because it will open up an entire world.
Beautiful. Stephen, what's your connection with poetry?
Yeah, poetry is interesting for me. So I was a public school student, so I know we did some poetry throughout, like when Eben was mentioning some Tolkien poetry. I remember a middle school presentation I had to do, and I picked some of his poems from like The Hobbit and some of his other works that I would do. But and then I would participate in speech or like speaking competitions in high school. They called it forensics but it wasn't like crime scene investigation. I don't know why it's called that. But anyway, one year I did a Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by
Oh,
T.S. Eliot as yeah, and there's poets like Eliot, and I know we're going to get to this a little bit, but it's interesting because sometimes I'm reading poems and I have no clue what they're actually talking about. But the words and I mean, like you're saying, reading it out loud and just hearing the words and the imagery, it gives a response. And so, you know, that's so I'm kind of I'm only dabbled my feet in the waters of poetry, I guess I think, but it's definitely interesting and yeah, again, we'll probably get into this, but like it always strikes me doing the office, morning prayer, evening prayer. It's so focused on the Psalms, and I'm kind of a prose person. It's like, why don't you just give me the instructions of what I'm supposed to be thinking about every day? But going through these different images that the Psalms present, which I guess I'm clumping in with poetry, a type of poetry,
it is.
it has a different effect than reading a couple pages by St. Augustine that's in the Office of the Readings or whatever. But
St. Augustine's very poetic, though.
yes, that's true. That's true.
In the Latin, too, he does some interesting things with the vowel length. And so you get actually a slightly like pseudo-poetic drift throughout all of his writings, which I've noticed with like Tolkien. You'll notice that as well, how even his prose reads like poetry sometimes.
So let's talk a bit about poetry's place in the Kolbe curriculum. This has been a project of yours of late, starting with the point that you wanted to make about how the expressive power of poetry can enrich a homeschool curriculum and nurture spiritual formation.
So Maggie started to touch on this, I think. And if you're familiar with our curriculum, you already know that there's poetry there, and there has been poetry there for a long time. But we're also trying to be very intentional about integrating it throughout the curriculum, bringing it down into the younger years, as Maggie was saying, just to like start to plant the seeds and set the stage for students so that they have this sort of dexterity and familiarity and comfort with language, so that by the time that they get to high school and they start reading the Iliad or other things that we read in high school, they're ready for it. They've been formed in language in a way that prepares them for this. So that's part of it, is that it's been there, but we're trying to be really intentional about sort of stringing it all together so that they can follow this path and be prepared over time, and then building out resources for families to help give parents what they need so that they won't be like me trying to pull all this stuff together on their own, develop their own courses. And sometimes it's a little hit and miss when you're doing that too, because you don't have this whole comprehensive thing. I knew I wanted my kids to have this as part of their education. I knew it was beautiful, and I wanted them to have beautiful things to learn. And I knew it was important to develop their minds and their hearts. But like, we're bringing in some intentionality here with it so that we're really connecting all those dots and bringing them up to where we would like them to be, and trying to give parents the resources so that they can collaborate with us on this and help their students be ready for what we're hoping that they'll be ready for, with the sort of great works that they get to engage with in high school.
You touched on how like getting ready for the Iliad. Um, and it's not actually just the Iliad, in my opinion. Just I'm not quite an educator, but I've had a hand in the poetry curriculum and whatnot. But I think also in order to read philosophy, you need to read poetry. And that's a bold claim, as philosophy points to truth, and it's often very dry. But the father of Western philosophy, well, other than Socrates, is Plato. I think it was Heidegger, but it might not have been Heidegger, who said that all of philosophy is footnotes to Plato. And Plato, throughout the Republic, throughout the Phaedo, has this undertone of how do the arts relate to truth? How does someone who loves truth relate to someone who loves beauty? And he himself actually uses a lot of poetic methodologies in his dialogues. And then you go on to Aristotle, who's very, very dry. But in the ancient world, he wasn't known as a philosopher, he was known as a poet. And then you have Augustine's Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And you just continue on the philosophic tradition. And then you get these great men like Chesterton and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien in the 20th century, who are widely respected and regarded among the kind of Christian, classically educated communities. And they were all poets and philosophers. So the way that these two things interact, I think, is very obviously intertwined and historically. And also, when you consider the ultimate end of each, the ultimate end of each is God. And so that spiritual formation, that resonating with truth that you can get by considering what is justice in the Republic, I don't think that will be fully complete if you don't ask what is beauty first, because that's kind of the thing that the human mind is most sensitive to. Like a child doesn't sit there and think, I wonder if it would be fair for me to do this. They have a sense of that. They'll be like, oh, that's not fair. But they have a much more nuanced sense of running out into nature and pursuing beauty. And I think a lot of the English Romantic poets kind of are just grown giant children in some ways, and that they have this wonderful sense of pursuing the beauty of nature. Um, and you can't understand the philosophies at the same time if you don't understand the poets that are kind of speaking to beauty at that time. And you often also see that when the poetry goes downhill and it loses that sense of beauty and therefore fails as art, because art's purpose is beauty. So art can fail to be art only insofar as it fails to be beautiful. You see that the philosophy often tends to also start to stumble on similar topics. And then the spiritual formation element, like we already touched on how the Psalms are poetry. And we also already touched on one of my favorite prayers, which is the Liturgy of the Hours. And I always am struck by the line in, I think it's Psalm 119 in Friday's night prayer, where it's, Lord, friend, and family, you have turned against me. Your horrors have overwhelmed me. My only friend is darkness. And it's like, wow, how do you process that? And there's a deep like element of resonating with the horror of the world, but seeing the good through it that just undertones Friday's night prayer, especially, and sorrowful mysteries. But it's a deeply poetic thing to be feeling that kind of overwhelming dread of the kind of horror of the universe, but to see the beauty through it and to see how God like takes that horror and somehow makes it beautiful, which I could connect to Tolkien, but I'll let Maggie talk.
Yeah. It's so wonderful. I was thinking as you're saying this natural sense that children have first of beauty in the world, and how this kind of there's this order of the beauty to understanding the philosophy. That's very true just in everything, right? Because we have to see the world we live in and around us before we can think about it and consider it. So we have to notice it. You can't set up a scientific experiment if you don't have the observations to build your hypothesis. You have to have observed what's around you. And in this sense, I think kind of build off this poetry is doing that, right? That's what you're kind of getting at. It's like giving you that connection to this beautiful world, this creation that then you can think about. So you think it's right that you can't really be very good at philosophizing about things if you don't understand things. Um, and the poets are so gifted at bringing that to you as you're talking about. So I'm thinking too about my favorite poem, which is Murder in the Cathedral, and just the feelings that you have as you read that when they're in the despair, you can just sense the despair, and then you can analyze the words, but you first sense it when when Thomas has is about to be killed, and you hear the franticness of the chorus as they're begging him not to, and what the world is like, and he even brings in all the senses, what you smell, what you hear, what you taste in that moment, and it's hideous, and you can experience all of that, and then you can reflect on it and
Hmm.
what the words are. So it is a beautiful thing, and I think it's really important. And obviously it leads to Christ because Christ is the Word. Words are important, and our words are important. And we should surround ourselves, just as we should with beautiful things, we need to surround ourselves with beautiful words.
Hmm.
Very important. And a lot of people fail to see that that's part of classical education in the way they do. Beauty is out there, and people see like a beautiful painting versus another. It's more obvious because it's a visual. It just appeals just to your sight first and then to other things. But words too are part of that beauty, and we really need to make sure we don't lose that. And we want our families intentionally doing that with their young children.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that comment on the painting is a good one because the fact that poetry is beauty through words makes it a bridge between the sensible and the rational.
As you encourage families along the way, Maggie, if you encounter one who is nervous somehow, hesitant about undertaking the poetry study, how do you like to encourage them in the beginning? I mean, much of what you have said is a beautiful encouragement there. If like kind of zeroing in on the one of the more recent comments you made about kind of losing some of this spoken word dimension of beauty, is there some way you like to kind of address that?
Yeah, well, first of all, it starts also with literature. So any good literature, but also good poetry. The children, as they hear a story, they're taking it in kind of passively. If you have them retell it, they can retell it in a simple way, sometimes in a more complex, depending on their level. But with poetry, when they memorize, not just read, but read is good, but also memorize it, that language becomes a part of them. It's coming out of their mouth. Those are their words and they're understanding those words. So they are participating in the act of an artist by not just hearing, but producing. And that's the very first thing. And as far as stepping through poetry, one of the points I had behind this making this book, and I can't take credit for it other than I really wanted this book done correctly and supporting our families and giving them what they wanted. But Erica, Eben, and Mara Mattioli are the three who have worked on this, but they've stepped people through those things with the pieces as we go along, so that the children are starting with simple poems with just a lyric kind of sing-songy thing to understand, very basics of rhyme, almost in a musical sense. And then we move through to more complex poems. And there is intentionality in picking them so that to answer the question of what we want parents to do, it's have them memorize, work through memorizing the poems, but do them with poems that are appropriate at each stage. Start with the very simple sing-songy ones with little kids. You move up to things with Jabberwocky, where you get a sense without words that are real, but you completely get the meaning. And then you move to the more complex poems that are, the Keats and the, um, whatever, whatever others, Shakespeare eventually. And then you're all set up to read the great epics later, which we have in our program. So I would say parents, what they need is a guide to go through all the steps. That's if you have that, it's hard to know that what if you haven't grown up with poetry, it's very hard to know what comes first, second, and third. They all look the same, but there are particular excellences that each poetry piece has that you can kind of order them for the age and stage of the child. And then the exercises, we're building out worksheets as we go along so that parents can focus. So we have very directed exercises. Even now in our second grade program in literature, we started there, and you'll see exercises geared to the poems with just simple little like learn the rhyme scheme, draw the picture, imagine what you're seeing, bringing in the senses. And we're just continuing to build from that point.
There's a point there with memorization. So one of my professors in uh, literary traditions too at UD, Dr. Kreider, I'm paraphrasing here because it's been like 3 years since he told this to me, but he made a comment that's always stuck with me about poetry, which is that you often in life will be faced with something that you don't know how to deal with. And it could be great, wonderful joy, kind of an exuberant moment of wonder. Um, it could also be something really, really horrific. Um, and So you have that like sense in like Dante, where in the first canto it says Tante mare poco più di morire. And it's like, well, that translates roughly to it was a pain more bitter than death, or so bitter as to be like death is a more literal translation. And so you can then see if you have this thing memorized, or in Robert Frost's Acquainted with the Night, there's a line in there where it's talking about loss and kind of walking. And I remember memorizing this when it was cold outside and I was wearing a coat and I was going on a walk. And there's that I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. And then I think it's 7 lines later. It's the fourth stanza at the start of it. There's that. And I heard a far away distant cry come over houses from a city street. That's paraphrased. And then this part's exactly quoted, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And there's that like it hits just right at certain moments in your life where you'll feel a certain something and you don't know how to express it. There's a certain emotion there that you just can't quite get at. But if you have this poetry memorized, then you can kind of have recourse to someone else. There's that ability to process what happens in life through poetry, where you can suddenly see the beauty and kind of the majesty of what's happening in life, even if it's really, really hard. Um, Also, Edgar Allan Poe does this beautifully in Alone, where if you feel isolation, there's that all I love alone. And so you just have all these different poets who hit on different elements of sadness. I focused on sadness partially because I just like edgy poetry. Um, all the sonnets I write are incredibly dark, which is the exact wrong thing to do with a sonnet. Sonnets are meant to typically traditionally be about love and joy and reflecting on the beauty of nature, and then all of mine are just these really like dark sonnets. Um, but it's just because that's the way I like to kind of explore poetry. So that having that memorization, it's having a friend to talk to. And it doesn't replace actual human connection, obviously. That's very important and also something that's lost nowadays. But it also gives you a way to relate to other people. In conversation, it's just wonderful to be able to cite poetry on the spot. Um, and you see this in the ancient tradition too, where they used to memorize the entire Iliad, the Greeks did. That was part of their education. So schoolboys, they'd learn it, and then the Romans did Virgil, and obviously the Hebrews would have the whole Psalms memorized, which is the Bible, so it's kind of in its own tier. Um, but there's just this potency of poetry to relate to beauty in a way that is not eternal, but beauty as a transcendental is kind of an eternal thing, in that it's an aspect of God. It's not to be confused with God, but it's an aspect of it. So it's a way of relating to God and also of relating to fellow man. Um, so that's kind of the point there that I noticed that maybe was useful to expound on a little bit.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about memory work, and I wanted to share something about my father-in-law. He was in an accident and he was paralyzed, and there were many times where he was suffering and he had memorized a vast number of psalms, poetry, and other things. And you would hear him and Bible verses. He would recite these to himself in very difficult times. So sort of talking about what Eben was saying, um, but when you have this stuff memorized, it's there for you. It can bring you comfort and you can draw from it at times, even maybe when you can't hold a book or you can't access a book, you have it available to you because it's in your memory. Even if you don't remember all the words perfectly, it's there and you can access it. Um, that's just something that it made me think of as both, what with what Maggie shared and how Evan was talking about memory work too.
Right. And children today are being trained to go to the internet, and when you want something, you search for it. And what happens on the day when the internet goes down? They're the most bored children in the world because there's nothing to do, nothing to entertain their brain. And, it's really important to have these abilities of active the ways to actively learn and to be able to recall things that you've done. So the the emotion that you feel with a good poem or a beautiful song or a beautiful work of art that you look at is all it can bring a catharsis. It can bring a release of emotions that, might need to be released or relate to the situation and are helpful. And, the internet just can't do that. It tries, but it fails. In fact, if you ask AI today for quotes from Cicero, they won't give you Cicero. They'll give you something in a Ciceronian style, but it doesn't mean anything. So we're even losing the substance of what's there with what we're getting these days. So it is very important for parents to push back against what's out there in the culture and to do so by kind of reconnecting with nature, with for their little children, with nature, with the beautiful world God has created around them, with the beautiful words God has given us, with the beauty of that we see all around us. And if we can do that, then our children will be okay because they'll have the tools that they will actually have the tools to do what they want to later. And if you don't do that with your little children, they may be handicapped later or have to learn it when they're older, and memorizing when you're older is much harder than when you're young.
Unless you practice a lot when you're young, because it develops a certain type of neuroplasticity. Doing a lot
Right.
of work does.
which is another reason to do it at an early age because
Mhm.
you're like, well, I mean, you can just be a vegetable, I guess, as a child, but you'd naturally be inclined as a child to fill your memory with something, and so this way you're filling it with something, like you're saying, beautiful and things that are good, so that they can be pulled out. But then, like you're saying, Eben, then you've built those neural pathways, if we're going to go in the neuroscience terms, but built the habits to be able to do that better when you're older.
Yeah, there's also the idea that a lot of the saints have had, and also just a lot of the great thinkers, where your mind should be the castle you can retreat into whenever you need to reflect on something and whatnot. And I think poetry is a great way to kind of develop that introspection that's a good introspection, because there's also bad introspection. There's that kind of repetitive, you actually see the poets like discuss that, the like kind of repetitive round about the prickly pear we go, prickly pear, round about the prickly pear we go at 5 o'clock in the morning. And that kind of like you can tell that the poets address this kind of like bad introspection where you like implode into yourself. And poetry teaches you to both be wary of that, but it also like lures you into yourself to then think about higher things. And so it then develops the kind of disposition towards reading scripture and thinking about scripture and the disposition, which, virtue is habitual right action. And so it could also be called a good disposition that's developed, or natural in some cases. And so it kind of builds that philosophic disposition, even if it's not directly a philosophic action in all cases.
I can see where, with what you've said, that it's poetry can be a regulating factor. It seems
Mhm.
like so, like you're putting together a number of things that you said, Evan. I guess where it's yeah, and Maggie too, encountering emotions, being able to kind of sit with them and work through them rather than either suppressing or shutting down.
Mhm.
So you can see this would be a really useful tool to just like, wow, like you're saying, I'm not even sure what I'm feeling, but here it is, and it's okay for me to sit there with it and figure it out and to think about it and then
Mhm.
move on. Where without things like poetry, you're just, yeah, it's harder to put words or make sense of it.
Exactly. And also with the memorization, there's that disciplining of the mind, forcing yourself to kind of churn over something that you've already repeated. And so it just builds that ability to force yourself to like be like, maybe I shouldn't be thinking that right now. Maybe I should just, spend my thoughts in a more worthy thing, because there's sins of the thought that people just don't think about very often. But also it just can lead to despair. Um, Not in a medical sense per se, but there's kind of that element of if you just dwell on the worst things in your life, well, you're not going to be a very cheery person. and you also will probably dwell on yourself too much. And so it helps you take things more lightly because you can just turn your mind away from yourself and kind of expand through taking in instead of like going inward, taking things inward, rather than by going inward, closing things off.
Okay, so Maggie, you've made reference to a book published by Kolbe and some of the poetry built into the Kolbe curriculum across the grade levels. Say more about that and how Kolbe's collection supports students' development in this manner.
Well, I'll say a little bit about it, and then I'll have Erica say some more, and Evan, some of the pieces that we picked. In Kolbe, we've had poetry in the curriculum, but it's just reading some poems. So one of our things was we had a poetry collection for eighth grade or seventh or eighth grade, and they would just read a selection of poems. So we took that um, those poems and we added some more to them. We added different types of poetry. We added descriptions of the kinds of poetry that they will encounter, the terms that they will see in the poetry, so that they're reading it both for comprehension, but also to kind of direct them to appreciate it as poetry, not just like, oh, here's this thing I have to read and it's written in some weird way. But we wanted to help them focus in on what is unique about this. What are the interesting things that are done here? How does it change? And, one of the interesting things in art is that over time you see art changes. So you can take particular artists and say, Giotto, major change in art was never the same after Giotto. Good. He made major improvements and things that were done. Caravaggio with light, kind of another turning point. And you can identify styles and periods of art as you go through and like this is what these people did, this is what they were focused on, these are the excellences that they had, and it often ties in, surprise, surprise, after our conversation here, to the philosophy of what was happening at the time. So you actually learn a lot about the world at that time from what the art, what the music, what the and actually what the poetry is. But we didn't have that intentionality with our poetry before, and we changed that so that they see the eras, they see the styles, they see the types, they see how poetry changes. They have to be able to understand the poetry is not just an A B rhyme scheme or an AAB, but that there's much more to it.
That's what was exciting about this update that we did. It's really a new book. We updated it, but before it was a collection of poems, and that was it. There was no context. So what Maggie's talking about here is we set it in the context of history, and we also related it to the poet themselves so that you can understand the poets aren't just poems that are a random thing that we've put together, but these come from real people. And this is the person who wrote this poem. And this is the context in which they wrote it. So this is the age that they were writing it in. These are the significant things that were happening around them. So it really gives context, historical context, but also human context, and how those relate together. And we talk about the themes in those different ages. Maggie came up with the name for it of classic poems across the ages. So that's what we have now. These are poems across the ages, and we also integrated a Catholic reflection into those different ages. So it's not just setting it in like a secular context, which is really most of the poems. There was a significant theological or spiritual things happening during all of the ages as they are now. So we just tried to articulate that. So then the students get a better idea of where these poems fit into history and what sort of people were involved in creating them. And I think it's just a really exciting development in our poetry curriculum, and it's starting to help really build that bridge that we're trying to build, so that the students, when they get into high school and they're engaging with all of this beautiful poetic content, they have, they've got the building blocks beneath them And so we're just very intentionally building that over time. But it was an exciting development, and and as Maggie said too, in the younger years, we're also building out these extra resources um, to give the students not just context, but also the nuts and bolts of meter and rhyme, so that when they open up a poem and they look at it, they can identify things like what type of poem this is. It helps you know how to interact. It's not like a cold call from the poem or whatever. You have some sense of, oh, this is what this is. I'm familiar with this kind of poem, or I'm familiar with that poet, or where this poetry came from, or oh, I see what's happening here. I see this. There's a meter being used here, and I'm starting to understand this. So when you open it, it's not. I think a lot of times poetry can feel daunting because if you're not familiar with it, you open it up and it's like, what's going on here? I have no idea what's happening with this. These words are maybe doing something interesting, or something that seems kind of pretty, or maybe something a bit weird and uncomfortable, and I don't like it. But yeah, it makes it. I think that it's building an appreciation. So it's not just for when we build that appreciation of the beauty, it's that can sometimes feel a little bit nebulous, but then when we are actually building it into the programming, we're doing this with a lot of intentionality, so that when a student opens a poem, they have the tools in their toolbox to appreciate it and to understand what they're seeing. And yes, there's all this beauty there too, but there's that part of the intellect that helps them engage with it. You need some certain tools sometimes to set it in context, to make it approachable. So that's what's exciting about this, is I think it's one more step to making it more accessible, more approachable, and it kind of help us unlock that, like gives us these keys, if you want to call them, to help unlock those beautiful things that we're trying to unlock.
I just wanted to add to that really quickly too. Eben gave us some additional poems for it, and I just wanted to mention that because we had a few very important types that weren't in there. And after reviewing it, he gave us some suggestions. So it not only is the poems in the context, but with the few very important additions. So that was also very wonderful. And thank you, Eben, for that.
I mean, you have to read Ozymandias. So,
So now
well,
you know, if you see it in there.
but yeah, to build on that just a little bit too, with kind of the structure of poetry and whatnot, and how it's so important to understand that structure. I was asked a number of times when I was at college, "You're a computer science major. Why do you like poetry so much?" And I actually think it's because good mathematics and computer science is technically a subset of mathematics in the general sense. Um, but that's a different discussion. But a program is something that has certain rules you have to follow, a certain structure you have to follow for the computer to be able to understand it. But its real point is to communicate to other humans who are going to be maintaining that code. And each dialect, whether it's Python or Java, has certain structures and certain patterns, and you do things in certain ways. And it's really about expressing an idea. And poetry kind of does the same thing. There are certain rules you have to follow. My opinion on that's a bit controversial, but I think I'm in good company in that I agree with Chesterton and Frost, and that, to quote Chesterton, free poetry is like free love. It's a contradiction in terms. And like Frost, free love's like playing tennis without a net. So these structures exist for a reason that is inherent to the activity, and it becomes incoherent and confused and fails to strike at beauty and fails to strike at truth when you just treat poetry as, ah, yes, you just take the words and mash them together and then you're done. But you still have to follow some grammar rules. You can bend them, but it has to be on purpose. And you have to follow a rhyme scheme. If you're not, then you have to have a reason to do it, like how Milton did in Paradise Lost. Um, Whether or not you agree with that being a good idea or not, well, the poet made a choice there and it has to be intentional. In a similar way, a programmer, you might disagree with how a different engineer built something, or you might disagree with how a certain mathematician went about proving a certain idea. But that kind of structure of thought that goes into poetry when it comes to actually making it is so important. And it's so wonderful that we're actually introducing students to a sonnet has 14 lines with a heroic couplet at the end. Why does it have to have a heroic couplet at the end? It usually is a transition too, where you start off with a certain problem or a certain idea, and then at some point, depending on the specific type of sonnet, you reverse that idea and or you solve that problem, and it usually comes in the heroic couplet that the solution is presented. Um, and so how a poet chooses to go about doing that is a message. It's a reflection on a certain idea in life. And as someone who's written a lot of sonnets, I pick on sonnets because I love them so much. And also even choosing the style of poetry. If I want to express kind of obsession and this repeated thought that I can't get out of my mind, this difficulty that just keeps coming up, then a villanelle is a brilliant choice because you have to repeat those lines again and again and again. And then only at the very end do you actually see the two repeated lines that you keep seeing throughout the poem. They finally are next to each other and they finally actually express the full thought of the poem. And so these choices that poets have to make that are kind of design choices that you could go about and not think about it really. But when you do think about it, suddenly you realize that there's so much room for expression and it's so difficult to be so idea dense. And that's what poetry is it's very idea dense. And so you can actually express truth through it, which I hope I've been alluding to occasionally throughout. Um, but that's what's been so wonderful about working on it is making sure that you have some like Keats, because Keats is a master of choosing to weave words together in a way that just continues to flow in a very sonorous way. And I had to be careful about what Keats I chose because Keats is a strange, strange poet in some ways. But I think we chose Ode to a Grecian Urn, but I might be wrong about that. But that one's just wonderful. And how he also chooses to relate to other past poets. And there's this tradition too, which is so important for students. And we did tie that in very well. And I tried to mention it, but a lot of poets will refer back to Homer, of course, because he's the master. Paraphrasing Chesterton, this which was our first poem may very well be our last poem. And then he goes so far as to say, if the whole world becomes pagan and perishes, the last man left alive would do well to quote the Iliad and then die. And so you have this like intense sense of there's a tradition here, and you need to continue the tradition, and poets are always responding to other poets. Philosophers always do that, but the poets also do it. And it's just I was so pleased to see how the sonnets all touched on certain ideas and responded to other ideas.
The enthusiasm that you have for it, the love you have for it, that makes it enticing.
Also write a poem. Like do try to write a poem. Writing one's first sonnet is just such a splendid exercise. You learn so much about yourself through trying to get your thoughts mastered enough to where they are in this strict form.
We will have in our show notes links to find out more information about what we've been discussing today, as well as a peek at some of the content that we've been talking about. In this case, some workbook pages. And there's a corresponding blog post that will go with this episode to delve more deeply into this and then send you off to find out more. As we're wrapping up, are there any final thoughts or takeaways or things that we didn't get to that you want to be sure we cover?
Read poetry.
Eben, it sure was a pleasure meeting you today. I hope it's a first conversation of many with you. And Maggie and Erica, it's always a pleasure to see you all. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me again, Bonnie, and for collaborating with us on these blog posts and podcasts and content offers so that families can start to engage with some of the new things that we're trying to share. And I'm looking forward to more of that.
Oh, it's been a real joy for me, and I love getting to see what y'all are working on. There's so much goodness coming out. So thank you for taking us through it.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, Holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad maiorem Dei gloriam.